So Dumbarton is celebrating 250 years, and we had a budget of $0 and big plans. And I don't have an inferiority complex. I love Dumbarton Church, but I also look to see what Foundry does. So when Foundry had their 200, then I saw that Bill and Steve had written a hymn. I thought, oh, shucks, they'll never do it for us. But I asked, and this lovely, lovely, kind gentleman, Dr. Reverend, did I get Dr. Reverend Phil Wogaman, and his son, Steve Wogaman, who's the director of the Detroit Chamber Museum, picked up the mantle. And then Steve took it home and invited his family to co-author it. And what they've done today is given us the most wonderful gift we could ever imagine. Not only is this an incredible poem that talks about who we are, but it's also a singable hymn. As a member of the choir congregation, that's really important. I just want to say we are so incredibly grateful, and of course, there's so many things you could talk about in your many, many years of music and theology. So thank you, thank you. You have 30 minutes to go.
Okay, well, it is
Let's
so,
give them a warm Dumbarton.
so good to be here. And when Ellen contacted me some time ago, quite a while ago, asking if I would write a hymn for the, what's the name? Whatever, 250th anniversary of Dumbarton Church. I thought, well, that would be a nice challenge. And I found myself writing. I'm not a hymn writer in the vein of Wesley or any of the other great hymn writers. But I enjoy writing it, and just a little bit about what it's like to write a hymn. You have to pay a little more attention than you would with regular poetry, because for a hymn, you pretty much need to look for the meter, and the meter of this is 8/7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's the meter that goes through the whole thing. And then you'll also probably need to pay attention to the rhyming factor. Not all hymns do that all the way, but I think that helps in singing if it doesn't seem too contrived. And I've endeavored not to make this contrived. Now, I have to tell you that after Ellen contacted me, my mind immediately began swirling around. How do I get at this? Well, Alan Mayer got me a copy for use of, was it Jane Donovan's edited history of Dumbarton Church, so I could have a better sense of what I'm writing about for this history of the church. Obviously, a hymn can't be the whole history, and I would imagine almost anybody who's really familiar with Dumbarton would look at this hymn and see the historical material that's embedded in it, but would say, well, you've forgotten this or you've forgotten that. Well, sure, you can't include everything in a hymn. Well, I have tried to catch the major points that we celebrate, and in part we regret as we look at our history as a church. Now, I'm going to read this in a moment. The people who are here have copies of the words of the hymn, and I guess the music too. But those who are catching this online, you don't have a copy of this in front of you.
They will have a copy in a moment.
Oh, they will?
Yes.
So they'll have it. So I'm going to go through it and highlight a few things about the hymn. But I found myself, and this happens in some of the other writing that I do, some of the best thoughts arrive as I wake up in the morning. You know, your brain has been rested, and somehow things come flooding in. And this, the writing of this didn't take as long as I thought it would. It's still like 2 or 3 weeks, and then came together and got some critique. And our granddaughter, Carolyn Fado, who's here, gave me a couple ideas to improve the connection with the meter and all of that. And I really appreciated her help with that. And then the music for it, I certainly can't compose music like this, but our son, Stephen, who's here, is a very gifted musician. He has a doctorate in piano from Indiana, a great music school, and he heads the Detroit Chamber of Music Society, which doesn't have exactly that name now, but it's the leading such organization probably in the country, and brings in top talent to Detroit. And, he knows the music scene greatly, but he's also a very gifted musician himself. And he readily agreed to work at music. Well, he worked at that, and that required a little bit of rephrasing of words here and there, and I don't even remember what they all were. But to get the meter of the words connected with what he was doing with the meter of the hymn and the music, and he will talk about that in a moment. But let me go through the hymn a little bit and say what I was trying to say with this about the history of the church. I will say again that having read the historical material that was available to me, much more than I knew about Dumbarton already, although my wife and I have been connected with this church for quite some years. She is officially a member as a clergy. I belong to the annual conference, and so I don't belong to Dumbarton, but we've had close connections here. And in fact, immediately after retiring from being senior pastor of Foundry Methodist Church, which was set up, by the way, by Dumbarton many years ago, having gone through that, I was aware of the kind of thing that needed to be done here, and so here it goes. And I'll be reading part of this. 250 years have passed since Dumbarton Church appeared. Those who came before have brought us legacies to be revered. 250 years is a lot of legacy there, and much of it can be revered. Born before U.S. creation, that is before the 1776, conscious of the nation's need, driven here by higher purpose, here combining word and deed. Each of those phrases is important. We honor the nation. Dumbarton Church has had connection with the nation in a lot of ways. Some of the earliest members of this church, when it did not even have this name, were quite connected with the Washington scene. Washington arrived as a city during the period of this congregation's start. But Henry Foxhall and others who were really prominent in this country in that time, well acquainted with President Jefferson and others. So this church had a lot of connection with the emerging nationhood of the United States of America. That's an allusion to that. At the same time, recognizing that the church serves higher purposes than the nation. We honor the nation. We seek to serve the nation's greatest purposes, but our purposes are linked to the word, to God's presence all over the world, to every nation. And so the higher values and traditions of the nation we observe here at Dumbarton. And then this next verse, that'll be a challenge, won't it? You know, when you do a celebration of this kind, you tend to think of all the good things that happen. Well, listen to verse 2. Sins and flaws we now acknowledge, we repent in grief and shame, seeking freedom from pretension and the gods of wealth and fame. Well, we acknowledge sins and flaws. You know, one thing I did not know until I was reading some of this history. From the beginning, this church had slave owners in it, and I believe at the very beginning, for several years, it had slaves and freed black people who eventually split off to form their own church, Mount Zion Church, near here, because they didn't like to be consigned to the balcony and that kind of indignity. But there were actual slaveholders here until into the 1840 or 1800s. I forgot just how far. But that was after the Christmas conference of 1784, which established Methodism as a denomination in the United States. And in the documents of the Christmas conference of 1784, there was a strong prohibition of slavery. But this church still had some slave owners in it for at least a couple of decades after that, I think even longer. So sins and flaws we now acknowledge. We repent in grief and shame. And then it goes on, teaching, learning from each other, young and old together grow. Learning here from one another more than any one can know. We all share the gifts of knowledge and teaching, and we have a thriving church school here with young people and old people. We all learn from one another. That's speaking of that. And then many here were once rejected. Many people in this church were once rejected, facing ridicule and scorn from a world of hate and stigma, now have found a life reborn. Now, this all began to happen in the late 60s and merged, and this became probably the leading Methodist church in the whole Washington area to welcome gay and lesbian people. And started out with a special service and then grew, and this became what we call a reconciling congregation. So numbers of people here felt rejected, but now all together are serving this a broken world in need, guided by a loving spirit, that the troubled can be freed. That is a big thing here. And this church has given leadership in same-gender marriage. I was involved in a lot of that, as well as other clergy connected with this church years ago. And then finally, in our worship times together, heart and mind together blend. That is, it isn't just feeling that connects us, it's also a mind. We are thinking people and we are feeling people. These are blended. And I think Dumbarton Church has done that to a turn. Very, very important. In God's presence, still beside us, deepen faith and truth attend. Faith and truth. Gracious Spirit, here to guide us in a future yet unknown. Signs of hope in broken places, love and justice can be known. Now, these are the notes I sought to embed in this hymn. I suppose one could add or subtract and so on, but these sort of captured my mind and spirit as I worked on this. And then what to do about the music. Well, with the gifted son and musician here, we had conspired in doing a similar kind of thing for Foundry Church a few years ago for their 200th anniversary. That was in 2015. And that worked out well. That caught Ellen's attention, and she thought, well, maybe Phil, and she would think just about Steve at that point, but maybe Phil could do this kind of thing again for Dumbarton, paying attention to our history and so on. And then, of course, I turned immediately to Steve. Steve, would you be willing to do the music for this? Oh, he said, he's our son, and a very gifted musician, and he readily did it. And I think he worked away. Took him time, and he said, well, it's time to put the words together, and he had help from his wife Michelle, and I think even Carolyn got a little bit into that part as well. And so this was a family effort in a way, and it's our gift to the church. We, no honorarium or anything like that. We just do it as a gift to this small but great church. And I'm going to turn this now over to Stephen.
I don't have a whole lot to add. One thing that really struck me as I sort of took on this second hymn writing assignment with Ed was the fact that I had never been in Dumbarton Church. In fact, my first time in Dumbarton Church is now. I've certainly been aware of the music series that is taking place here. It's one of the more distinguished ones in the country. But my awareness of Dumbarton really comes from knowing about what this place meant to my parents after leaving Foundry. And my impression, based on conversations with them, was that Dumbarton quickly became a home for mom and dad after such an incredibly kind of unprecedented, wild period at Foundry, with the President of the United States showing up every third Sunday or something like that. And that immediately sort of, for me, colored the kind of music it would be. Now, this hymn presented some enormous challenges. We talked about the meter, the 8 + 7. Don't believe it. So just to give you an example, if you read the first lines of verses 2, 3, and 4, they go very nicely. They trip off the tongue. Sins and flaws we now acknowledge. Many here were once rejected. In our worship times together, 250 years have passed. Wow. So actually, I started by writing the tune around verses 2, 3, and 4, and then tried to make sort of shoehorn verse 1 into the mix. And there was input not just from people in my own house, but Carolyn Fado got involved in it and emailed me something, and I confess I can't remember what was in it. I do know that my original treatment of this was in duple meter, not triple meter. I cannot remember how that went. One thing I can remember, and this is one that caused both Michelle and my son Teddy, who's a very gifted horn player at major at Oberlin, came racing down into the music room and said, "No, Dad, you're playing it wrong." And that is the second two lines, which in the script would be in the text would be then you've got to go born before without taking a breath. So you're gonna have, there's so many syllables, you're gonna have that moment where you have to breathe. And Michelle came down and made the point, no, it really is better the other way. So there was this sort of toggle point between the two. But then it turned out that triple meter was best, and it turned out that maintaining the 2/8 notes of upbeat to a downbeat in every verse made the most sense. And then the thing kind of wrote itself. When I'm not a composer, and so when I write music, I grab a white sheet of paper, go to the stabs, and then I start making little dots and things, and try to remember what I'm improvising, and then try to make some more dots and sometimes chord symbols to figure out what the other parts were going to be. But some inner voices started to emerge that I really found I loved a lot. And if you have the score of the tenor part on the first measure of this, the first beat of the second measure, I don't know if my thumb slipped or something, but there was this gorgeous thing that was there to be had, and so I wrote that in. But I think if you compare it to the hymn we did for Foundry, which in duple meter is a little bit more formal, and I had kind of a starting point for it that was, "Oh God, our help in ages past." Same key as the normally published key, and it's a little sort of grander. But then thinking about my parents coming here after Foundry and finding this warm welcome and home, it's a totally different thing. And for me, it captured what my idea of Dumbarton was. Play it? Yeah, let's hear it. Okay. I appreciate very much whoever scored this thing in proper notation. I used a free shareware thing to sort of scribble it down on the computer, and this is, I was worried about how this was going to happen, so thank you, whoever did it.
Mayor, you want to tell us to do it now?
Look at the words while he plays.
I can't play my own tune. Let's try this again. Singing first and second
It'll
verse
be a
or
good
something
practice because we're going to sing it during the service.
today?
Today.
Then we better practice.
But let's sing a verse. The congregation is going to sing verse 4. So let's try verse 4.
I think Ellen, in the directions here, suggested time for questions or comments from any of you. Anybody?
How long did it take to put it all together?
You first. We did not both work on it at the same time, although both Carolyn and I had a fair amount of input as the tune was evolving in seeking adjustments and accommodations. But you want you to go ahead and say how long it took you?
Sure. Of course, there were perfections that had to be added. So I'd say the basic work, top of the head, 2 or 3 weeks. But it was a preoccupation during that period, constant. I'm almost thinking about it, waking up to it. In fact, I had a little pad next to my side of the bed. And something would come to me in the middle of the night. Write it down and then try to read my handwriting. That's about it.
The melodic contours came to me almost immediately, but as I say, it was something that was originally a duple meter and the meter in different ways. Actually, it's funny, in hindsight, there was a thing I wrote a long time ago when I was alone once in a tiny little stone Presbyterian church called Grand Memorial Church in Whitesburg, Kentucky. It's very close to the border of Virginia, south of Hazard. And the DNA of the tune is, if it's from anywhere, it's from that. You want to hear that?
Yeah, sure.
This is the original Kentucky tune?
Yeah.
Steve, would you play ours again, just following that? Whoever's singing bass, don't sing that note I played.
Any other questions or comments? Way over there. I see a hand.
Thank you, Phil, for that wonderful exegesis of the poem, verse by verse. To help us understand how you built our history into it.
And thanks for your input on all this.
And Steve, thank you for explaining how you went about constructing this and how you moved from duple to triple meter and how it seemed to fit.
Yeah, the triple meter was imposed by the other name on the score, Michelle, who is a beautiful singer. Just said they'll never be able to sing that. And then once it was firmly established in triple meter, that was when Teddy came downstairs. Teddy's room is right above where the piano is, and Teddy came down and said you're skipping a beat, or you're adding a beat. I guess you said you were adding a beat, because the da 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 needed to be before the downbeat. So.
Nancy?
Well, just second all the great things and your wonderful contribution. So what I'm struck with is the exquisite collaboration that you described between the two of you, but also your family. And so I'm just wondering, is that a common thing for you all to work closely together when you're creating in the creative process?
Well, that would make it, that makes it sound like I'm an active composer. And I'm not, and it makes it sound like I'm writing hymns all the time. No, it's, the Spirit has to lead you. The Spirit has to lead you. And, you know, a lot of that Spirit came right out of this congregation. That made it easier. And I should add the Spirit. My wife, who's here, Carolyn, after whom Carolyn Fatal was named, my granddaughter, she was, in terms of the Spirit and so on, very much an inspiration always. And we're here at this evening, we'll have a celebration of her birthday, which will be, was 2 days ago, but it's going to be a family gathering. So combining things. So. Anybody else?
Okay, go ahead. Were you participating in, or did you read the Many Witnesses book, or participate in the history?
No, in fact, I was only barely aware of it. It had been done before we got here and all that. And, Alan Mayer was very helpful to me. Now, I didn't read the whole thing. I was working away on him. And there's no way the hymn could put all the details in the book. I mean, the hymn can't do that. But I think I got the Spirit, the significant part of it. And, I think I partly knew where to look in the index. But I was struck. And that second verse really captures this. I was struck by some of the flaws at the beginning. You know, slavery, racism, deeply embedded in the country, of course, for many, many years. But that had to be acknowledged. Didn't mention racism per se here. Didn't get into that kind of detail, but to note that this is not a time for pretension about our history. Acknowledging the flaws and celebrating how the breath of God has moved through this church. And I think especially in recent years, through some of the culture wars that this country has gone through, this church has been out in front of a lot of things. And I trust it isn't perfect even now. Is it perfect? This part of the church is perfect. You were here. No, no church is perfect, and we're all sinners and looking for something better. And I would trust that when the 300th anniversary comes around, and I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't expect to be here then. There will be new insights that have come along the way that might make this moment, in some respects, seem a little obsolete. I don't know. And this alludes to the future yet ahead. And our challenge is to make this a better world.